Thank you for that much too generous and very kind introduction. And very many thanks to all of you for coming along this evening. I know that many of you have come a very long way and rearranged all sorts of bits of your life to be here tonight. I know there are at least 3 people who've come specially from the ski slopes, and many others have done battle with the M40 or with Avanti trains to get here. And I'm touched, and some of you who know me well might find this hard to believe, I'm even a little humbled by the efforts that you have made this evening. It means a very great deal to me that you are all here, and it's a real pleasure to see so many friendly faces this evening. And I'm especially grateful because I'm very conscious that for many of you, the decision to come here this evening required considerable courage. University lecture theatres can be scary places. In some, they trigger grisly memories of hours of golden youth wasted listening to the beard-muffled mumbles of men who were even older than your parents and significantly younger than most of us are now. Others among you may never have been in a university lecture theatre at all, either because you never went to university yourself or because you went to Oxbridge in the 1980s. Either way, you are venturing into terra incognita tonight. Here be dragons. So thank you for confronting your fears. I'm delighted that the University of Birmingham is trying to reinstate the tradition of newly appointed professors giving inaugural lectures. It's a tradition which went out of mode for a while, one of the sort of frills and lacy bits of old academia, which found no place among the drab utility fashion of modern higher education. It dates back, so far as I can find out, at least to Tudor times, when it gave a newly appointed professor a chance to demonstrate both his scholarship, always his, of course, in those days, and not coincidentally, sufficient religious orthodoxy to save him being burnt at the stake the next morning. My job this evening is, I'm very pleased to say, somewhat easier. All I have to do is to keep you alive, awake, and if possible amused, until you can decently get a drink. I cannot hope to match, surely, the 2 greatest examples of oratory from literature. I'm thinking, of course, of Gussie Fink Nottle's immortal prize-giving at Market Snodbury Grammar School, and Jim Dixon's climactic lecture in Kingsley Amos's Lucky Jim. The latter, a lecture delivered, of course, by a history lecturer at a red brick Midlands university, seemed more relevant this evening. Not least because in my career, like Jim, I have been remarkably lucky. And that's how this lecture got the rather flippant title, I'm afraid, of Merry England. Inaugural lectures are an opportunity to offer a personal view based on a lifetime of experience and supposed wisdom of the state of one's discipline and where one thinks its future may lie. So this evening I'm going to try and do 3 things. First of all, I will explain a little, very briefly, many of you have heard the story before, how I came to be standing here. Not in, I hope, in a I didn't get where I am today, CJ from Reggie Perrin kind of a way, but because, as a historian, I can't resist filling in the context for what I'm going to talk about, which is, secondly, the state of military history today, and then thirdly, I'd like to discuss the nature of war itself a little, and to suggest that an interesting and valuable way to proceed might be to take a look at it from a radically new angle, and one which puts not politics, but the human at the center of our discussion. Now, I couldn't really tell you when I started being in love with history, because I don't really remember a day when I wasn't. There are a few highlights that stand out, however. At the age of 3, I was given a plastic Tommy gun as a consolation present from my newly born baby sister. I don't think she knew she was giving me the present, of course. Turned out to be not a bad trade. Tommy gun for a sister. I remember my mother pointing out one Saturday that if I didn't just buy a comic and some sweets every week, I could save up, and every 2 weeks I'd be able to buy a real book. And that seemed a very exciting thing to do. Like many in this room, I suspect, I was deeply impressed and affected by Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth. I remember very long afternoons in the local library choosing books for the following week. Most of them seemed to be about Napoleon. Air-fixed soldiers, of course, and then when I was a little older, model aeroplanes that my father could enjoy making. Sundays on the sofa watching black and white war films, and history lessons from Mr. Wharton, which I now realize were largely rehashes of those films. And above all, the tolerance and encouragement of a rather bookish little boy by a family which, as my prep school headmaster put it when I won my scholarship, was not, and I quote, not wholly academic. I was incredibly lucky in my teachers and fellow pupils at the boys' boarding school, where my mix of book learning, low cunning, and outright thuggery, no, Martin, I said thuggery, allowed me to flourish in ways that the more etiolated atmosphere of late 1980s Oxford perhaps did not. University was fun, though, as was my next stop, the city, where again I had a lot of fun, made many friends, and for about 20 years enjoyed traveling all over the world. But I suppose I was never a true natural at finance, and travel that looks glamorous when you're 20 becomes a chore when you're 40, especially in post-9/11 airports. So by 2006, as you've heard, with selfless encouragement from my wife Yuko, I was back at school at King's College London in the Department of War Studies. And here again, I was deeply lucky in my teachers, Bill Philpott and Alan James in particular, and in my students, fellow students, I should say. Bill and Alan showed me a face of academia very different from what I had previously known, and helped to decide me on a second career teaching history myself. And then I was incredibly lucky once more, lucky in the kindness and the warm welcome extended to a new PhD student by the military history community, lucky that a job here came up when it did, very lucky to have had the support of a number of people in this room and elsewhere to get that job, and really, really lucky in the colleagues and the students that I have been privileged to work with and to teach ever since. It's a cliche to talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, but every single person in this room, wittingly or unwittingly, and dozens of others, not here today or no longer with us, have helped me in my life and career. Thank you. And now, the University of Birmingham, in its supposed wisdom, has appointed me Professor of Military History. Were I not eating the university's salt, I'd have to put that decision down to either negligence or incompetence. But as it is, the only explanation that I can offer on the record, at least, is luck. Oh, lucky Jim, how I envy him. One of the harder questions on the application form to become a professor is the one that asks what title you'd like to adopt in the event that you're promoted. And I chose Professor of Military History, which will seem a bit counterintuitive, I suspect, to some in the room. After all, in the words of the old jibe, military history is to history as military music is to music, or as military intelligence is to intelligence. And to many, reading military history is a little like middle-aged males squeezing themselves into Lycra and cycling around Richmond Park. It's little more than a vicarious thrill delivery mechanism for those who are too lazy or too cowardly ever to have done anything else worthwhile with their lives. In this view, at best, military historians use outdated methods to ask outdated questions, endlessly and mindlessly recounting the blades of grass in the Shenandoah Valley or the rivets on a Sherman tank. At worst, they shade off into the glorification of war or into Sundays spent dressing up in black and leather like Charlotte Rampling in The Night Porter. Insofar as that stereotype of the subject has intellectual roots, they lie perhaps in the great big, fat, red Morocco volumes of Victorian and Edwardian military history. Written largely by retired soldiers and long on tactical detail and armchair generalship, they were designed to mobilize the battles of the past to help other younger soldiers win the battles of the future. And they were also, in effect, unilateral declarations of military independence from civilian control. War, they proclaimed, was the business of soldiers, a highly technical game governed by rules and principles that only soldiers could hope to understand. Only the right kind of very rare civilian, proper chaps like Julian Corbett in the case of the Navy, could be admitted to this charmed circle. When in the late 19th century, Hans Delbruck dared to challenge the orthodoxy of the Prussian General Staff over how Frederick the Great had won his wars, the generals turned on him with a ferocity that only a professor of modern history at Berlin University and a member of the Reichstag could withstand. Now, there are still idiots around who argue, and I quote, that no civilian historian can be considered credible until he can attest to the fact that he has, while carrying a combat load, road marched 25 kilometers, conducted 1,000 meters of advancing by short rushes, and then spent the night in an open bivouac. On the whole, however, over the last 100 years, the character of war, the questions we ask of military history, and the way we ask them have all three evolved and have revolutionized its study and created a new and vibrant discipline full of potential, and that's what I'd like to go on to discuss. Let's take very briefly the changing character of war itself first. During the 19th century, under the impact of three revolutions, this changed dramatically. The French Revolution mobilized whole nations for war and established the military not as a separate caste of warrior, loyal only to the king, but as the embodiment of society. The Industrial Revolution freed labor from the farms to serve in the ranks or to work in factories, turning out new and ever more lethal machines of war. And the Technological Revolution provided the railways and the telegraphs to move and control the new million-man armies that resulted. In Europe, the effects of this first became clear, perhaps, with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, a war decided at least as much by the social and political structures of the two states engaged as by what happened on the battlefield or what Moltke, Bismarck, and Napoleon III did or didn't do. And importantly, a war which was waged as much by and on the civilian population of France as by conventional armies. Winning wars was no longer about packing the generals off on campaign and leaving them more or less to get on with it, but it was about managing the interface between the civil and military spheres of effort, maximizing both and trying to overmatch those of one's enemy. In the words of the patron saint of modern military history, the late Professor Sir Michael Howard, I quote, "Campaigns and battles are not like games of chess or football matches conducted in total detachment from their environment according to strictly defined rules. Wars are not tactical exercises writ large. They are conflicts of societies, and they can be fully understood only if one understands the nature of the society fighting them. The roots of victory and defeat often have to be sought far from the battlefield, in political, social, and economic factors which explain why armies are constituted as they are and why their leaders conduct them in the way that they do." So with wars such as these, military history could no longer be autonomous as it had been in the Victorian Edwardian period. To quote Howard again, I quote, "To abstract war from the environment in which it is fought and study its technique as one would those of a game is to ignore a dimension essential to the understanding not simply of the wars themselves, but of the societies which fought them. And this is the key point coming up. The historian who studies war, not to develop norms for action, but to enlarge his understanding of the past, cannot be simply a military historian. For there is literally no branch of human activity which is not, to a greater or lesser extent, relevant to its subject. Now this, to me, is one of military history's greatest selling points. But it's not without its problems, as we shall see in a moment. So the changing character of war itself seemed to demand that military history expand its toolkit. And nothing shows this more clearly than the 29 volumes of James Edmonds' military operations series of the British official history of the First World War. The last of the 29 volumes was published in 1948, 30 years after the events that it described, and of course 3 years after the end of a second and even more terrible war. As a reconstruction of the tactics and operations of a single massive campaign, they are a remarkable achievement. But rather like Mr. Casaubon's Key to All Mythologies in Middlemarch, they also managed totally to miss the point. By the time the official histories came out, the history of the First World War had been captured by other voices, and the world itself had moved on. At the same time, broader history itself was changing. As the profession expanded after the Second World War, and as new voices, not all of them recruited from the traditional gene pools, made themselves heard as historians, traditional preoccupations with political, diplomatic, and imperial history were first supplemented, and then in some cases supplanted, by new interests. First wave, we've kind of talked about a little bit already, this one of interest in social and economic history, which gave rise to the so-called War and Society School of the 1960s, a movement which sought to situate war and the military within broader society and vice versa, along the lines sketched out just in the quote I just gave you from Michael Howard. The 1970s saw a second wave with the coming to the fore, especially with the publication of John Keegan's The Face of Battle, a new interest in the voices and the experiences not only of generals, but also of ordinary soldiers. And the ensuing democratization of military history has endured. And it's very hard, I think, now to imagine popular historians of the war such as Anthony Beevor, James Holland, or even Max Hastings, writing books without exploring the view from the foxhole. The same decade also saw the foundations being laid for the so-called cultural turn, directing attention to the values, beliefs, assumptions, and preconceptions of ordinary people. This in particular has real value for military history, where it's a useful antidote to a recurring tendency to get overexcited about the material at the expense of the mental. And since then, we've been lucky enough to see an explosion of new histories of, among other things, material culture, emotions, race, gender, and minorities, many of them seeking to restore voice and agency to those who were denied it in the past. People have also sought out transnational comparisons and global histories, both of which are immediately and very obviously applicable to military history. And all of these have added texture and color and richness to our understanding of the past, and they all have value to add to the study of war too. Now, there are some who distinguish between military history, which they tend to equate with their old-fashioned drum and trumpets kind of approaches of the kind that I stereotyped above earlier, and a new history of warfare, seen as a modern and progressive attempt to incorporate all these new approaches. Now, my view is that if people want to call themselves historian of warfare rather than military historians, they are perfectly entitled to do so. It's all a little bit People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front. The most prominent specialist chair in the UK, the Chicheley Professorship at Oxford, in fact changed its name from military history to history of war although it did so in 1946, when I suspect it was thinking more about the distinction between military and naval history than between military history and history of warfare. Now, I do think sometimes, and I'm very far from the first to make this critique, that in the drive to capture the detail of the stories untold in the periphery, sight is occasionally lost of what lies at the core of the subject and makes it distinctive, which is, after all, war. After all, as Michael Howard, again, said, after all allowances have been made for historical differences, very Michael Howard caveat that, after all allowances have been made for historical differences, wars still resemble each other more than they resemble any other human activity. The nature of war, after all, lies in, quotes, the use of violence to compel an enemy to do our will. That's from Clausewitz. On balance, however, anything that involves looking at old questions in new ways, or indeed that generates new questions, seems to me to be a good thing. And by assuming the title of Professor of Military History, I am deliberately making the claim that I take an inclusive view of what military history is, one which incorporates rather than rejects the history of warfare, in inverted commas, and that I reserve the right to try to apply any or all of these approaches if they will help understand my subject. It's the right thing to do, but it's also the self-interested thing to do. And one way that I hope military history will develop and grow is to integrate such tools and approaches more thoroughly, even than the best historians try to do today. Now, I don't want to give the impression that everything in the military history garden is lovely. Higher education is under a pressure it hasn't felt for over 30 years. And the humanities are finding student recruitment dropping. Not as hard as in the United States, where undergraduate numbers taking history are down about 30% in the last few years, but still down by 10% or a little bit more in the UK. Some of this is about jobs, of course. Some of it is demographics. But some of it is disillusion with a discipline which has too often made itself unlovable by slipping into solipsism. For reasons that I do not understand, the return of war to Europe does not yet, at least, seem to have prompted as much of a resurgence of interest in studying the subject as, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan did. Even world-renowned university departments originally founded on military history seem recently, hopefully temporarily, to have forgotten its value. And as a military historian, it remains difficult to find an audience for one's work in the most prestigious history journals, to secure grants for research from the main funding bodies, or even to get a job in the first place. And yet, since only the dead have seen the end of war, so only the dead have seen the end of military history. And since the history of war, as Clemenceau almost said, is too important to be left to the military, it will always, I think, have a future in the civilian universities. And I'm pleased to say that it remains in robust health here. We are lucky in Birmingham that our undergraduate modules on military history always recruit well, and our online master's program in military history remains the market leader. And I know some of the people in this room either have studied on that program or are currently doing so. All I need for my cup of happiness to be complete now would be some nice benefactor to walk through the door with a checkbook and give me a few million quid to set up a nice shiny new research centre so I could have a clean office in a building with loos that worked. Actually, now I think about it, any office would do, just at the moment. I'd like to come back to the point about war being distinctive, though, because I think it might point the way to another possible future for military history. One of the ways that war is distinctive, and one of the things that makes it interesting, I think, is that it is simultaneously, to borrow Trotsky's phrase, the locomotive of history. It's a mechanism for managing change and resolving disputes within the international community. And it is, in a sense, inherently anti-historical. Most, or even all, general history is about what Michael Geyer calls the assertion of social life and the continuation of civility. It's about how we get on with each other over time. And it's always set within the context of society because we are, of course, social animals. But war isn't about how we get on together, it's about how we don't get on together. It threatens the very survival of society. There are only two other things I can think of that threaten the survival of society in the same kind of a way. One, I suppose, is crime, and another one would be governments which despise the culture which make life worth living and the education that makes it possible. But both of these other threats depend for their power for their existence, on the existence of society itself. To use the argot of the tech dudes, they are bugs rather than features in the code. For war, however, destruction of property, destruction of life, of trust, civility, and eventually of society itself are hardwired into the design. Unchecked, as Clausewitz pointed out, war would be, I quote, a complete, untrammeled, absolute manifestation of violence with death and destruction. I've finished quoting him, by the way, now. With death and destruction driven by passion and hatred, escalating and being delivered without stint until one side or the other succumbed. At least that's Clausewitz's theoretical view of how it works. In the real world, he accepts that there are factors that prevent that from happening. And the two main ones are, first of all, what he famously called friction. Sod's law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. One of his favorite quotes, which I use on an almost daily basis, is in war, everything is very simple, but the simplest thing is very difficult. And secondly, the second factor is his other quotation, which everyone knows, that war is the continuation of politics by other means, by which he means that the violence that one deploys should be proportional to the ambition of one's objectives. So when Bismarck said that the Balkans were not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier, what he was doing was calibrating his willingness to use force against his political objectives. Bit of a shame his boss didn't listen in 1914. In practice, therefore, reason, operating through politics, and chance, expressed through friction, work to dampen down or to limit the escalation driven by popular passion. And it is this interplay between those three, between reason, chance, and passion, the so-called Clausewitzian trinity, which define the character of any given war. Now, this trinity is an extremely powerful framework for analyzing war, and it has proved highly fertile. Looking at war primarily as a political activity worked very well for the great wars of nations fought between 1792 and 1945. And it also captured one of the most important essences of war, which is that in war, the violence needs to have a political purpose. Violence that serves no political purpose is just nihilism or West Ham fans away. And yet there are, I think, two problems with viewing war primarily through this prism of politics. The first is that it's a very poor description of how most people experience war and how they think of it. For them, war is horror, pain, and fear. Politics matter very little when you're staring down the barrel of a gun, or for mothers cowering in their cellars from the bombs while they wait for their children to make it home through past the snipers. For them, war is the realm not of rational probability, but of uncertainty. One form of courage, that which allows young men and women to put their lives on the line, even when the odds are against them, is about accepting that uncertainty and learning to live with it. And we read war memoirs because we think that they give us an idea of what war is really like for humans like us. But paradoxically, most military historians like me then tend to discount them as historical sources, at least as historical sources of anything other than the experience of being a human in the middle of a war. We complain that they tell only part of the story and that individuals in the foxholes can't see the bigger picture. So we look elsewhere for the patterns that lend war meaning. Rather than having the courage, perhaps, to follow through and draw the conclusion that this kind of personal evidence demands, which is, I think, that war is, in a sense, important qualification, in a sense, inherently meaningless. The second problem with viewing war as a rational activity, the continuation of policy by other means, is that although it worked very well for those 19th and 20th century wars, it has turned out to be a poor guide to action, at least in our recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and perhaps Ukraine. Now, that's not the only reason that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan went wrong. We'd be here all night if I started listing them. But there's no doubt that the leaders who took us into both conflicts were flawed men who made their decisions in irresponsible ways and who failed, most importantly, to do what Clausewitz said was the first and most important task facing any commander, which was to understand the character of the conflict they were about to get involved in. To think that they could solve political problems, the intractability of which, by the way, they completely underestimated with a stroke of the sword, was a fundamental and terrible mistake. But most of the critics who have looked at Western conduct of those wars, up to and including Chilcot, have identified failures and suggested solutions in the future, guides to action, which are to do with doing established things better. So defining and communicating ends, objectives better. Allocating means to those objectives better. Choosing appropriate ways to accomplish those ends better, or more appropriate ways to accomplish those ends. So in other words, the answer, this model, generated by this model of war, it seems to me, is to apply more rationality. Now, this ends, ways, means model strikes me as a pretty good way to analyze ex post what went right or wrong. And it also seems like a pretty sound framework for winning a world war, where survival is at stake, the ends, objectives are very clear, and all necessary ways and means are going to be applied to try and achieve them. But it doesn't seem to me to fit so well to the Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine kind of case, where they are effectively, at least from our point of view, limited wars, where the ends we can hope to achieve are not independent external variables. They are highly dependent, in fact, on the ways and the means that we are prepared to sanction the use of. The interdependency, it's all a bit circular, the interdependency of ends, ways, and means in conflicts of this kind demands a more holistic ex-ante view, which allows us to set all of those three legs, as it were, ends, ways, and means, at once. This is not a decision that can be broken down into its components and solved and then reassembled, as the orthodoxy would tend to suggest. It requires, I think, an approach that relies on instinct, on experience, and what Clausewitz calls genius, human creativity. We are now, in Clausewitz's terms, in the realm not of reason, but of chance. In mathematics terms, we're not managing risk anymore, where probabilities can be calculated by sophisticated computers and undesirable outcomes hedged against. We are handling uncertainty, where humans genuinely don't know what will happen, yet still have to make decisions and to act. Now, what I'm suggesting here is, of course, scary. It's the kind of thing that gives bureaucracies a fit of the vapors. And I don't pretend to have thought through all the implications for strategy or even for history. A future project perhaps might embrace some of those. But there are, I think, 4 reasons in favor of embracing this kind of an approach, this approach that centers on the uncertainty of war. The first is that it's hard. One of the virtues of military history has always been that it's hard. The chains of causation are so complex that they demand deep and broad understanding of a huge range of factors to untangle. It needs, I beg your pardon, to use Isaiah Berlin's famous or cliched distinction, not hedgehogs who reduce everything to one big idea, but foxes who are capable of handling multiple, complex, and sometimes even conflicting lines of thought. And I suspect that the new approach I'm talking about will only add to the complexity and make it harder. And that's a good thing. To paraphrase President Kennedy, we choose to study history and the other things, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Secondly, as I suggested just now, it fits the facts of how humans experience war much more closely than the icily detached Mandarin approach of politics by other means. Gaza, in particular, seems to fit a model driven by the passion and chance legs of the Trinity much more closely than a policy one. But there are applications to Ukraine too. And thirdly, and what makes it attractive rather than scary, I think, is that making decisions in an uncertain world is precisely what humans, or at least some humans, are good at. It's where we can use our inbuilt creativity as no computer will ever be able to do. Any damn fool can make a decision if he knows all the facts. Only the best, the brightest, and the bravest can do so in an uncertain world. Take the human out of war, and we not only understand the nature of war that I mentioned about the use of violence to compel an enemy to do our will, i.e. the fact that it's about human desires and fears and intentions, we also, by doing so, deny moral agency. And that's worse. And that leads us into my fourth and final point about this, which is that acknowledging the human reality of war and that we are responsible for the terrible decisions of wartime, those which we take ourselves or ask others to take on our behalf, seems to me to make explicit the moral and ethical dimension which it is our duty as citizens and as humans to form a view on. I'm delighted that military history is popular on the high street, but it needs to be more than just another part of the entertainment industry. Ukraine and Gaza are just the latest conflicts which, even though we are in both cases not ourselves directly involved, we surely have a duty as humans to take a stance on. Now, I'm not a philosopher, much less, thank heavens for all our sakes, one of the statesmen or soldiers responsible for sending young men and women to die or to kill on our behalf. I'm a historian, and as such, it is primarily my job to try to understand the decisions made by humans in the past, not to judge them. I do my best to embrace empathy while steering between the Scylla of sympathy and the Charybdis of antipathy. As a human, as well as a historian, however, I have always found it hard to be morally neutral about war, and that gets harder as I get older. I try to retain some humility about it. I know I always have the advantage of hindsight, and I'm very aware that I'm in the privileged position of the critic, free to comment, weighed down by none of the responsibilities of those who were, like Hamilton, in the room where it happened. The one thing that is certain, however, is that there will be more war, and therefore it is incumbent on all of us to understand it and what it does to people as well as we possibly can. And if I can play any part in that, even just the tiny one of helping a few of the students who walk through the doors here to learn more about war through the study of military history broadly defined, well then, I'll settle for that. Thanks very much.